She was just a farm girl sharing bread with a hungry child. But in 24 hours, her simple act of kindness would bring 300 armed warriors to the edge of her world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Voss homestead when Magnolia heard the rustling in the tall grass behind the chicken coop. Most folks would have grabbed their rifle first and asked questions later. But Maggie wasn't most folks. She set down her basket of eggs and moved toward the sound with careful steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. A boy, no more than 12 years old, crouched between the wooden slats like a wounded animal. His dark skin was stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and his clothes hung loose on his thin frame. Native, alone, and clearly starving. Their eyes met for one frozen moment. The boy's gaze held a mixture of fear and desperate hunger that cut straight through to Maggie's core. She could see him calculating whether to run or fight, his small hands trembling as they gripped a makeshift spear carved from a broken branch. Instead of calling for her father or backing away, Maggie did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the piece of cornbread she'd saved from breakfast. Without a word, she placed it on the ground between them and stepped back. The boy stared at the bread, as if it might disappear. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, and Maggie realized he was trying not to cry. When he finally reached for the food, his movements were quick and desperate, like he expected her to snatch it away at any moment. He devoured the bread in 3 bites, then looked up at her with something that might have been gratitude. Or maybe it was just the recognition that she could have hurt him and chose not to. Either way, it was a look that burned itself into Maggie's memory. She wanted to give him more, to ask his name, to understand how a child ended up alone and hungry on their land. But the sound of her father's voice calling from the house made them both freeze. Sterling Maddox had fought in 3 Indian raids, and his tolerance for natives on his property was exactly 0. The boy must have understood the danger, because he was gone before Maggie could blink, melting back into the tall grass like smoke. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where he'd been, her heart still racing from the encounter. When she finally turned back toward the house, Maggie had no idea that her small act of mercy had just set in motion a chain of events that would bring an entire tribe to her doorstep. She didn't know that 300 miles away, a grandfather was preparing to move heaven and earth to find his missing grandson. And she certainly didn't know that her piece of cornbread would soon become the difference between war and peace for everyone she loved. But as she picked up her basket and walked back to the house, something deep in her gut told her that everything had just changed. The boy's eyes had held more than hunger. They'd held a story that was far from over. Sterling Maddox stood on his porch with his rifle cradled in his arms, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read danger in every shadow. His weathered face was set in hard lines as he watched his daughter approach the house, something different in her stride that made his instincts prickle. "Everything all right out there, Maggie?" His voice carried the weight of a man who'd buried too many neighbors to take anything for granted. Maggie forced herself to meet his eyes, even as guilt twisted in her stomach. "Just collecting eggs, Pa. Nothing unusual." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she knew what the truth would bring. Sterling had lost his brother to a Comanche raid 5 years ago, and the scar on his left shoulder served as a daily reminder of how quickly mercy could turn deadly. But Sterling wasn't fooled. 20 years of frontier life had taught him to read people as well as he read the land, and his daughter was hiding something. "You sure about that?" "Thought I heard voices." Before Maggie could answer, their neighbor Ezra Whitmore came riding hard across the field, his horse's hooves throwing up clouds of dust. The man's face was pale as winter frost, and sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the cool morning air. When he pulled up at their fence, his hands were shaking. "Sterling, we got trouble. Big trouble." Ezra's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Found tracks this morning. Native tracks, fresh ones, heading straight through our properties." Sterling's grip tightened on his rifle. "How many?" "Hard to say. Could be a scout, could be more." "But Sterling," Ezra swallowed hard. "These weren't random tracks. They were searching for something, or someone." Maggie felt the boy, the desperate look in his eyes, the way he'd vanished so completely. She thought about the breadcrumbs still scattered in the grass behind the chicken coop, evidence of her choice waiting to be discovered. "We need to gather the families," Sterling was saying, his voice taking on the commanding tone he'd used during the raids. "Get everyone to the church. If there's a war party out there, we need to be ready." But even as the men talked strategy and defense, Maggie couldn't shake the image of the boy's face. He hadn't looked like a scout or a warrior. He'd looked like a lost child, alone and afraid, the same way she'd felt when her mother died last winter, leaving her to navigate a world that suddenly seemed too big and too dangerous. As Ezra rode off to spread the warning, Sterling turned back to his daughter. "Maggie, I want you to stay close to the house today. No wandering, no matter what. You understand?" She nodded, but her mind was racing. Somewhere out there, that boy was still alone, still hungry, still running from something that had separated him from his people, and now her people were preparing for war against his. What had her simple act of kindness set in motion? And was it already too late to stop what was coming? By midday, the church bells were ringing across the valley, their urgent tolls carrying a message every settler understood. Danger was coming, and it was time to choose between fight or flight. Families streamed toward the center of town with whatever weapons and supplies they could carry, their faces etched with the kind of fear that had become all too familiar on the frontier. Maggie sat in the front pew beside her father, watching as neighbors she'd known her entire life transformed into something harder, more desperate. Old Mrs. Patterson clutched a shotgun with arthritic hands that still knew how to kill. Young Tommy Fletcher, barely 16, had painted war stripes under his eyes with mud and ash. Even Pastor Williams had traded his Bible for a Winchester rifle. But it was the children that broke Maggie's heart. Little Sarah Murphy clung to her mother's skirts, her eyes wide with confusion. Baby James wouldn't stop crying, as if he could sense the violence hanging in the air like smoke. These people were her family, her community, her world. And somewhere out there was a boy who looked just as scared and helpless as these children. "Listen up, everyone," Sterling called out, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "Ezra's confirmed at least 20 tracks heading our way, could be more. They're moving systematic-like, checking every homestead, every hiding spot. Whatever they're looking for, they're not giving up easy." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Martha Hensley raised her hand. "What do you think they want?" "Sterling, we haven't had trouble with the tribes in over 2 years." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Could be anything. Stolen horses, kidnapped folk, revenge for something we don't even know we did. Point is, it doesn't matter what they want. What matters is we're ready when they come." But Maggie knew what they wanted, or at least she was starting to suspect. The boy hadn't been a scout or a threat. He'd been lost, separated from his people, probably during one of the recent storms that had torn through the territory. And now his family was coming to find him, not knowing that the settlers were preparing for war. She thought about speaking up, about telling them the truth. But every time she opened her mouth, she saw her father's scarred shoulder and remembered the stories he'd told her about Uncle Jacob's death. These people had lost too much to trust easily, and she was just one girl with a story that sounded impossible. The afternoon dragged on with endless discussions of strategy and defense, where to position the marksmen, how to protect the children, when to make a stand or when to run. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a new sound cut through their planning. Drums, deep, rhythmic, echoing across the valley like a heartbeat made of thunder. The kind of drums that spoke of ceremony, of ritual, of power that went back generations. Every conversation stopped, every breath held. Even the babies seemed to sense that something monumental was approaching. Sterling moved to the window and peered through the curtains. His face went white as fresh snow. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What is it?" Pastor Williams demanded, moving beside him. "You need to see this for yourself." One by one, the settlers crept to the windows. What they saw defied everything they thought they knew about frontier warfare. The hills around their small town were lined with warriors, hundreds of them, sitting motionless on horseback like statues carved from living stone. They weren't charging or shouting war cries. They weren't burning or destroying anything. They were just waiting. And in the center of that vast, silent army, an old man with silver hair and painted face was holding something in his hands. Something small and white that caught the dying light of the sun. It looked like a piece of bread. The silence stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. 300 warriors sat motionless on the surrounding hills, their presence so overwhelming that even the wind seemed afraid to blow. Inside the church, grown men who had faced down wolves and outlaws found themselves trembling like children. "What are they waiting for?" Tommy Fletcher whispered, his voice barely audible above his own rapid breathing. Sterling kept his eyes fixed on the old man in the center of the formation. There was something about the way he held himself, the way the other warriors deferred to him, that spoke of wisdom earned through decades of leadership. This wasn't a war chief looking for blood. This was something else entirely. "He's holding something," Pastor Williams observed, squinting through the window. "Looks like bread?" Maggie's heart nearly stopped. The piece of cornbread she'd given the boy, saved and carried back to his people like evidence of mercy in a world too quick to assume the worst. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her pulse hammer against her palm. "I need to go out there," she heard herself say. Every head in the church turned toward her. Her father's eyes went wide with shock and fury. "Like hell you will. You're not taking one step outside this building." But Maggie was already moving toward the door, her mind clearer than it had been all day. "Pa, they're not here to fight. If they wanted to attack, we'd already be dead. 300 warriors don't sit around waiting for permission to destroy a town." "Maggie, you don't know what you're talking about." Sterling grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "These people are savages. They'll scalp you before you get 10 feet from this door." The word savages hit Maggie like a slap. She thought about the boy's eyes, the gratitude and fear mixed together, the way he'd tried so hard not to cry while devouring her bread. "That boy I fed this morning wasn't a savage, Pa. He was just hungry." The confession dropped into the church like a stone into still water. The silence that followed was so complete that Maggie could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Sterling's face went through a dozen emotions before settling on something between rage and terror. "You did what?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I gave him bread. He was starving, Pa. He was just a child." Before Sterling could respond, the drums stopped. The sudden absence of sound was somehow more terrifying than the rhythmic beating had been. Through the window, they watched as the old chief raised his hand, and every warrior on every hill dismounted as one, their movements synchronized like a prayer made flesh. Then the chief began to walk down the hill toward the church, alone and unarmed, carrying the piece of bread like it was something sacred. With each step he took, the tension in the air grew thicker, until it felt like the very atmosphere might shatter from the weight of what was coming. Sterling cocked his rifle. "Whatever happens next, Maggie, you stay behind me." But Maggie was already reaching for the door handle. Some conversations, she realized, could only happen face to face. Maggie stepped through the church door before anyone could stop her, her legs trembling but her resolve solid as granite. The chief was halfway down the hill now, moving with the careful dignity of a man who had learned that every gesture carried the weight of his people's future. Behind her, she could hear her father's strangled curse and the scrape of boots as the other settlers positioned themselves at the windows with their weapons ready. But Maggie only had eyes for the approaching figure. Noting the silver threads woven through his dark hair, the lines carved deep around his eyes, the way he held the piece of bread like it contained the answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. When he reached the bottom of the hill, 20 feet from where she stood, he stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across a divide that felt wider than the valley itself. Then he spoke, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "You are the girl who feeds the lost." It wasn't a question, but Maggie nodded anyway. "I gave him bread. He was hungry." The chief studied her face with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "My grandson, Ayanna. The storm took him 3 days ago when he wandered too far from camp. We have been searching." He held up the bread, and Maggie could see that it had been carefully preserved, wrapped in soft leather to protect it from the elements. "He brought this to us, told us of the girl with kind eyes who shared her food when she could have called for men with guns." Sterling's voice came from behind her, tight with barely controlled panic. "Maggie, get back inside, now." But the chief's attention shifted to the church, and his expression grew sad rather than angry. "Your father fears for you. This is good. A father should protect his children." He paused, his gaze returning to Maggie. "As a grandfather should protect his grandson." "Is he safe?" Maggie asked, surprised by how much she needed to know. "The boy, Ayanna, is he okay?" For the first time, the chief's stern features softened into something that might have been a smile. "He is safe, but he speaks of you often. Says you looked at him like a person, not like an enemy. This is not common in our world." The weight of those words settled over Maggie like a heavy blanket. She thought about all the stories she'd heard growing up, all the tales of savage raids and brutal killings. But standing here, looking into this man's eyes, she saw something that complicated every simple truth she'd been taught about the divide between their peoples. "What happens now?" she asked. The chief reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew something small and carved from what looked like bone. A bird, she realized, with wings spread wide in flight. Ayanna made this for you, to say thank you for the kindness when kindness was not expected. He held it out to her, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. The carving was warm from his hands and smooth as silk. But this is not why I have come with so many warriors, he continued, his voice taking on a gravity that made the hair on Maggie's arms stand up. We come because there are others, bad men who follow our trail, who mean harm to your people and mine. They think to use Ayanna's disappearance to start a war that will profit only them. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of galloping horses, moving fast and hard toward the settlement. The chief's head turned toward the sound and his expression grew grim. They come now, he said simply, and your people must choose. Fight beside us, or die because of us. There is no third path. The thundering of hooves grew louder, and Maggie realized that everything she thought she understood about this day had just changed completely. The riders that crested the eastern hill weren't what anyone expected. These weren't more natives coming to join the massive gathering. These were white men, but not settlers. Their clothes were too fine, their weapons too new, and their horses too expensive for honest frontier folk. Maggie counted at least 30 of them, riding in formation like a military unit. Mercenaries, Sterling breathed from the church doorway, his experienced eye taking in their organized approach. Professional killers, the chief nodded grimly. They call themselves the Clearwater Company. They make money from conflict between our peoples. They take land, sell weapons, collect bounties on both sides. His weathered hand tightened around his ceremonial staff. They took my grandson to make us angry, to make us attack your town. Then they would come as heroes to save you and take your land as payment. Maggie felt sick to her stomach, but Ayanna escaped. He found his way to me instead. Yes, and ruined their plan. So now they come to make the war themselves. The mercenaries had spread out across the valley floor, positioning themselves between the town and the hills where the tribal warriors waited. Their leader, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, rode forward with a white flag tied to his rifle barrel. But Maggie could see the mockery in his gesture, the way he smirked as he approached. Well, well, the scarred man called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Looks like we got ourselves a situation here. Indians surrounding a peaceful settlement, holding folks hostage. His gaze shifted to Maggie standing beside the chief. And looks like they already got themselves a prisoner. Sterling stepped fully out of the church, his rifle ready. That's my daughter, you bastard, and she's exactly where she chooses to be. The mercenary leader laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Is that so? Well, Chief, I'm afraid I can't let this stand. These good people have hired my company to protect them from exactly this kind of savage aggression. We hired no one, Pastor Williams called from the church steps. We don't even know who you are. But the scarred man ignored him, his attention fixed on the chief. Here's how this is going to work, old man. You and your warriors are going to attack this town, like you planned. My men and I are going to defend it heroically. A lot of people are going to die, including you. And when the smoke clears, well, somebody's going to have to take care of all this empty land. The chief's voice was steady as stone. And if we refuse? Then we'll start the fight ourselves and make it look like you attacked first. Either way, this valley gets cleared of both your people and these stubborn settlers. The mercenary's smile was sharp as a blade. Difference is, if you cooperate, some of the children might survive. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Maggie looked around at the impossible situation they found themselves in. 300 tribal warriors on the hills, 30 armed settlers in the church, 30 professional killers between them, and her standing in the middle with a piece of carved bone that represented the only bridge anyone had managed to build between two worlds. But as she watched the mercenary leader's face, she realized something that made her blood run cold. This man wasn't just planning to steal their land. He was planning to eliminate every witness to his scheme. Chief, she whispered urgently, he's not going to let anyone live. Not your people, not mine. We're all just obstacles to him. The old man's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the terrible weight of leadership, the burden of making choices that would echo through generations. The mercenaries were raising their weapons now, and time was running out. What happened next defied everything the mercenaries had planned for. Instead of chaos and confusion, instead of panicked shooting and desperate last stands, something else emerged from the moment. Something they hadn't counted on. Unity. Sterling Maddox stepped forward to stand beside his daughter and the tribal chief. his rifle pointed not at the warriors on the hills, but at the mercenaries in the valley. "Maggie's right," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "These men aren't here to protect anyone. They're here to steal everything we've built." One by one, the other settlers emerged from the church. Pastor Williams, Tommy Fletcher, old Mrs. Patterson with her arthritic hands still steady on her shotgun. They formed a line between the mercenaries and the hills, making their choice clear. The tribal warriors began to move down from their positions, not to attack, but to join the strange alliance that was forming in the valley. The scarred mercenary leader's confidence faltered as he realized his carefully orchestrated plan was crumbling. "You fools don't know what you're doing. These savages will turn on you the moment the shooting stops." But the chief was already moving, calling out commands in his own language. The warriors spread out in a defensive formation that protected both the town and the settlers, their weapons trained on the Clearwater Company. What should have been a massacre was becoming something else entirely. "Last chance!" the mercenary leader snarled, raising his rifle toward Maggie. "Choose your side." The shot that rang out across the valley didn't come from his gun. Tommy Fletcher, barely 16 years old, had put a bullet through the man's shoulder before he could pull his trigger. And then everything erupted. But it wasn't the chaotic bloodbath the mercenaries had expected. It was a coordinated defense. Settlers and warriors fighting side by side with a precision that spoke of shared purpose. The professional killers found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and facing an enemy that understood the land better than they ever could. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When the smoke cleared, half the mercenaries were dead and the rest were running for their lives across the prairie, abandoning their horses and their schemes. The Clearwater Company's war for profit had ended before it truly began. In the aftermath, as the wounded were tended and the dead were counted, Maggie found herself sitting on the church steps beside Ayanna, who had appeared from somewhere among the warriors during the fight. The boy looked healthier now, his cheeks fuller, his eyes bright with life instead of desperate hunger. "You saved my people," he said in careful English, offering her another small carving, this one of a wolf. "And yours too." Maggie smiled, pocketing the gift alongside the bird he'd made for her. "We saved each other." The chief approached them, his weathered face showing satisfaction rather than triumph. "The mercenaries will not return. Word will spread of what happened here, and others like them will know this valley is protected." Sterling joined them, his hand resting on Maggie's shoulder. "What happens now?" "Chief? Between our peoples, I mean." The old man gestured toward the hills where warriors and settlers were already working together to bury the dead and tend the wounded. "I think that has already been decided. The children have shown us a better path." As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maggie realized that her simple act of sharing bread had indeed changed everything. Not in the way she'd feared, but in a way she never could have imagined. Two communities that had lived in suspicion and fear had found common ground in the face of a shared threat. The bridge between worlds hadn't been built with treaties or negotiations. It had been built with kindness, one piece of bread at a time. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.